Welcome, my friends, to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and beside me is my good friend John Henry, and we are the host of this program. And so we invite you to open up your Bibles and to study along as we engage in study from God's Word. At the end of the program, you'll be given the opportunity to subscribe to the program that will notify you when the program has started, and so that you can join in. Also, there's additional information about the websites and the congregations in which John and I preach. And so again, we encourage you to study along with us. And if you have any family or friends that would be interested in the program, let them know about it so that they too can join in, subscribe, and also get additional information. John, in our last discussion, we had been talking about Abraham, and we got up to where his conversation with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I want to kind of pick up there in chapter 20, where we have been discussing about the scheme or plan of redemption of man, how it's unfolding, beginning with the life of Abraham. And so that brings us to chapter 20 in the dealings with Abimelech, who is king of Gerar. And as we talk a little bit more about that, hopefully that we'll learn some more lessons about what faith is all about, what's involved in our relationship with God, and how we too need to grow just as Abraham grew in his faith, in his relationship with God.
Yeah, this is one of these things, as they say, history repeats itself.
Yes. Yeah.
This is what's going to happen here once again. And like you said, in chapter 20, we see that the Bible teaches us that Abraham journeyed from where he was at that time down into Gerar, which we know was a city of the Philistines. And, you know, that is also down close to where... well, I don't know how far maybe it would have been, but over towards the Dead Sea, they believe around that area that's where Sodom and Gomorrah was. So he was down there, and that would have been off to the east of him at that time. So he's somewhere parallel with what just happened, all this destruction. And so that kind of put that in our mind as to the location in which Abraham is at right now. But the interesting thing, as he's down there once again, he's going to run into a problem. Again, we need to remember that the Bible teaches us that Sarah was a very, very attractive woman.
Yes.
And that's why Abraham was always so afraid, and journeying like he was, that somebody would always want to take her.
Right.
But he was always afraid to say, well, she's my wife, she belongs to me, because he thought, well, they'll kill me, take her, and right. So I just say she's my sister. And so we're going to go through that process once again here in chapter 20. Here he's going to meet a man or a king by the name of Abimelech, who is the king of Gerar, it says. And of course, they probably had scouts and things out, because the Bible said he sent and took Sarah. And but there was a problem with all this, because he couldn't sleep very well that night, Albert.
Right, that's exactly right.
He was having bad dreams, maybe. God came to him that night in a dream, and told him that you better not touch Sarah, because that is Abraham's wife. And again, Abimelech really hadn't done anything wrong. I mean, he hadn't touched her or anything, but you can see how God is trying to protect Abraham. Even though Abraham is making all these blunders, right, God is still working in the background to help him.
That's right.
To bring this scheme of redemption, this great plan to save man, to fruition. And so, when we look at chapter 20, it says, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man for the woman which thou hast taken. for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Said he not unto me, she is my sister. And she even herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. For I also withheld thee from sinning against thee. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know that, or know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. And therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told these things in their ears. And the men were sore afraid. Now, Abimelech, questions God and says, would you destroy a nation, an innocent nation, because of this? Something that he would done. And then he said, as he's talking to God, he said, now, didn't he say this was his sister? And didn't she say that that was her brother? But now we're getting into one of these half-true things. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, Albert, people look at today, sometimes we look at things that are half-truth, and we seem to think that that's all right, that God's going to accept that, Right. What do you think about that?
Well,
that kind of thing.
Well, John, when you look at what transpired here, this half-truth led to almost the destruction of someone who was innocent. And so you can see the danger even in that. And God let it be known that Abimelech was basing his action upon the things that Abraham and Sarah said. And they were telling these half-truths. And so he took her. He said, okay, if that's the case, therefore, I'm going to take her as my wife. I'm going to add her to, I'm going to take her as my wife. Uh-huh. And so it would create a whole bunch of problems. So half-truths does not solve any problems. It only creates problems. And that's what lies do. Lies create problems. They don't solve problems, because you always got to be looking over your shoulder, making sure you cover your tracks, and even then it leads to the harming of the innocent.
Yeah, that's like, I believe it's been said at different times that, you tell a lie, and then you got to tell more lies to cover that lie. Right. And then pretty soon you can't remember the lies you told.
Right. Yeah, exactly right. That's right. Yes.
And so another interesting thing I find here, Albert, is in verse 5. He says, said he not unto me, she is my sister, and she even herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands have I done this. And this word integrity means to be wholesome or upright, innocent, or sincerity. And so, but God did not deny, that Abimelech wasn't, had some kind of evil purpose or evil motive, the way it sounds to me. Instead, it's just the opposite. God recognized that, this man is a wholesome man, and he's sincere, and he doesn't really have any evil intent. No. But should you decide, you decide to, do something, there's going to be a lot of trouble, because you have another man's wife at this point. And so, like you said, he was going to take Sarah as his wife, or add her to his harem, which is what they did a lot of times back then, when kings had,
there were these large harems with and adding.
Yeah, and a lot of times when they would go to war and they take
Right.
the women, the spoil, and some of those women would become slaves,
That's
some would
right.
become
That's right.
added to a
Yeah,
harem.
absolutely.
And so they, here's Abraham and him out there wandering around. And
Right.
so, he sees all this. So, but another thing is, and God realized this. I don't know if Abraham really realized this, but think about the consequences.
Right.
Look at the promise that God made to Abraham and Sarah. That was to Abraham and Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's already done it once, and now he's doing it again.
Right. So
So look at the consequences. I mean, if God would let something like that transpire or, take place, so...
there was a point, John, that you mentioned. I really want to just point that out again, and that was about the aspect of integrity. Here's how or sincerity. There are a lot of people who are truly sincere in striving to serve God, but they're not doing things the right way.
Yeah.
And you see Abimelech's situation similar to that.
Yeah.
And so the true integrity or the true sincerity is that God points out, no, you're about to engage in something that I do not approve of. And once Abimelech heard God's instructions, he did something about it.
Yeah.
He conformed to what God instructed him to do. So that's true sincerity. True sincerity is when you and I, when we find out we're doing something and we think that it's right, but we find out that it is wrong. True sincerity stops doing the thing that is wrong and then starts doing what is right, because we thought that was the way it should be done. Mm-hmm. And Paul even expressed that with his life. He thought he was obeying God when he was persecuting the Christians. But when he found out that that was not the right thing to do, he changed. And you could see that transformation in his life as he conformed to the image of Christ Jesus. And so again, you see, this is what is involved in the whole process of our dealings in life. We're going to strive to do things that are right, but sometimes in that striving, we find out that they are wrong. So we make the necessary changes as we learn the truth about them. And this is what Abimelech did. And Abraham is also learning himself about integrity and those type of things as his dealings with God. And you could see that in the next part of this discussion that they have here with Abimelech rectifying the problem.
Let me interject this maybe here too.
Sure.
Another thing to think about in all this, let's just back up a minute. What just happened here? Yeah. The Lord was there talking to Abraham. Mm-hmm. And he just got done telling Abraham, you're going to have a son, the son of promise. Well, so we go from the Lord standing there talking to the destruction, and then we're introduced to Abraham moving down towards that way around the Philistines, and then this transpires. And it's, to me, don't you think that says maybe a little bit about his faith? At this point,
absolutely,
and that that his faith is not what it maybe needs to be.
Right.
He's not totally yet trusting in God for some reason.
Yes,
and maybe that had something to do with why the promise was made. I mean, the promise was made, but yet it took years before God fulfilled that promise.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And you begin to wonder, did this, was here's a man of God, and God comes and he makes these promises, but yet when we see Abraham in this light, we see his foolishness.
Right. Yeah.
His foolishness sometimes come out, and sometimes we might even be like that.
Right.
As we go through life, and we know the difference between right and wrong, but there may be times in our life where things become kind of, we do things, and then we think to ourselves, why did I do that? That was kind of foolish.
Right, yeah.
And I think Abraham needs to sit sometimes and reflect. But another thing, sometimes we maybe do things that are foolish because we are weak in the faith.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a growing process.
Yes.
That's what it is. That's what faith is. So we learn this lesson from Abimelech about integrity, sincerity, and then we also learn from Abraham of how there are things that we need to continue to work on in our lives as we continue this journey of faith with God.
And another thing that kind of stands out here is, God's, providence, if you want to call it that, or just His power. God wasn't going to let anything stand at this point in the way of His accomplishment.
That's right. That's right.
And so, He kind of superseded all these things here. And as you look at the story of Abraham as it unfolds in the Bible, you see that with God, because again, that we need to remember there was 3 promises, but there were some more promises made there, and that was one of the promises. God promised Abraham, no one's ever going to hurt you, and so somehow that slipped through the cracks of his mind for a while, because this happened once, and what happened? God come to the rescue. Well, here it is going to happen again, but here comes God. Yes. And so, that promise that God made to Abraham is being fulfilled.
Right.
I mean, as far as that, and God promises us the same thing, but sometimes I think we maybe are like Abraham in the sense that we don't put forth we don't have the kind of faith that we need to have. Because Abraham is such a good lesson.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And that's, I think, you go over to the New Testament and you've got all these writers that picked up on Abraham. Mm-hmm. You notice the faith of Abraham, the faith of Abraham. It's all talking about the faith of Abraham. Right. So, there's a lot of great lessons, I think, that need to... So
John,
there.
So John, you're saying basically the faith is not in Abraham, but the faith is in God, and that's really what you're learning throughout this, because we see those things transpire. Even when it comes to Abimelech, there's some things wrong in Abimelech's life. This point just shows us that there are people who do have integrity, that they are sincere, mm-hmm. that they don't know until they find out, they change. And so you learn these lessons about growth, and we shouldn't be assuming that a person isn't. We don't know until we sit down and talk with them, or you hear their side in these matters, because again, the faith should be in God and not in man.
And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul said.
Absolutely.
We must put our faith in God and not in men.
Right.
And if we put our faith and trust in God, then we're going to follow God's ways.
That's right.
And the point is, of course, we're going to obey His commands. But, like we said, even though this was half truth, it was still wrong. Right. Because Abraham, Sarah was his half sister, but still at the same time, what he was doing, it's wrong. It's sin. And of course, we talked about that. So the end never justifies the means, so to speak. A lot of people, make a play on that. Well, the end justifies the means. Well, it didn't in Abraham's case, did it?
Right. Yeah.
It didn't. But that's we see people today. They keep using this phrase, the end justifies the means. And what they're saying is that, we'll use any means we want to justify the end result. Mm-hmm. And they do this in religion. And you can't do that. The Bible specifically teaches us that we have to do what God says always. We can't, this idea, we can ask, where did this idea come from? The end justifies the means. Did it come from God? Did it come from heaven? Or did it come from men? Yeah, well, the answer is pretty simple. It came from men.
That's right.
God never said anything about that, kind of things. I mean, the end justifies the means. Well, let's look at an example. Let's take the Olympics. And so here's some of these great Olympic runners, and they're out there. But yet, here's an Olympian that wins the gold medal. But later on they said, ooh, you was using drugs. And he says, well, the end justifies the means. And then that's, once he says that, it's all right. Well, we know it's not. They take the medal away. Yeah. And that's been done at different times. And so even in our society, we kind of learn that kind of thing.
Because it violates the principles of integrity, the principles of sincerity. It violates those principles. And so Abimelech even brought that to Abraham's attention there in verse 9. And when he calls Abraham and he says, and what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin by doing what he did? And he says, you have done to me things that ought not be done. And he was right. Yeah. He is right about that. And so it is that great lesson, especially in his dealings with God, conversing with him in the dream about his situation. So he recognized and made those points aware to us as we're reading this account.
Yeah, then as it goes through to the end of the chapter, again, it's like a repeat of what happened with the king of the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. God tells him to, he's given sheep and different sheep and cattle, goats and things, and then oxen, and he's given men servants and women servants, it says in verse 14. And of course, Abimelech gave Abraham his wife back. And then he said, well, the land's before me, go ahead and go. And he got 1,000 pieces of silver. And so he got all these things. And you think about it, Abraham, was a man of great wealth, but let's look at how God blessed him. Now I'm not advocating that just because we walk with God and do what God says that we're going to be wealthy people. That's not what I'm. Right. I'm just want us to see that yes, God is taking care of Abraham. He's blessing him as he continues his journey throughout the land. I suppose traveling back then might be the same way like today. When we travel, it's expensive. You got to stay places, you got to have food, you got to buy this, that. Right. And so, God told Abraham when he got him to the land of Canaan, he could go from one end to the other, and he did. He spent his life, traveling through the land.
Right, that's right.
And when you think about it, you come to the conclusion, because there's nothing new under the sun, Solomon said, that this is going to take some money. Right. To do stuff. It's going to take servants and things like that to help and to buy things and to prepare food and all the things that we do. Everyday life, and then of course, the interesting thing about at this point is God shut all the wombs of the women, in the kingdom there. But yet Abraham, when he found out about it, prayed to God and asked God, to remove that curse, and then. God did. He kind of took it away. And, I don't know, I've read that at different times. It says, verse 18, for the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And I take that because of what all transpired.
Right, absolutely.
And so God brought that upon them as a curse, as a warning, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah. Well.
Well, then that takes us into chapter 21, which we're vastly running out of time here, in connection to this study of watching these things unfold. In chapter 21, we'll just kind of talk a little bit about that, John, with the remaining time that we have, especially there in the first few verses. And what I find interesting in these first few verses of chapter 21, you get this time frame. And the time frame is now that Abraham is 100 years old. Here his wife Sarah is 99, again, past childbearing age. And God answers the promise, or fulfills the promise that he made to Abraham and Sarah with the birth of Isaac. And what we see, John, in the passages, that it's letting us know that from the time that Abraham comes to the land until this time of the birth of Isaac, you're looking at about 25 years that has transpired. Mm-hmm. And with the 25 years, in our mind, that's a long time. Mm-hmm. But in God's plan of things, mm-hmm. it's right on time. And that is what we need to understand from this and learn what God is showing us by this time frame. That God made a promise, he fulfilled that promise. He fulfilled that promise in his time, not in Abraham's time or when Abraham wanted it, but when God wanted it. And here we find and see the might and power of God to open the womb of Sarah, where she does give birth, exactly as he said it would take place there in chapter 19 in the conversation. Mm-hmm. This time next year, you're going to have a child. And here we have here Isaac. So it just shows us, again, that God means what he says. We have to wait on him, and that's a part of faith. Faith is waiting on God and dealing with God on his timetable. Because there are things that God sees that you and we don't have a clue. There are things that God knows that you and I don't have a clue. So as we trust him and wait on him, it will be on time, and it will be exactly what we need as we are following his will. And so here with Abraham, granted, God made the promise concerning the son, and through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, in bringing about the unfolding of his plan. But it's exactly when God wanted it to take place and start. And that's where we see and learn here in chapter 21.
And another thing that we see too is at this time when the child is born, Abraham obeys God. He takes the child, yes, and circumcises Isaac, as said, and then we see that of course Ishmael is going to make fun of Isaac, right, and yes. Sarah gets upset about all that and tells Abraham, well, she's going to have to go. Right. And so we will talk about all that next Thursday, the Lord willing. Yes. And another thing, while I was thinking about it, this Isaac, the word or the name Isaac, I believe, means laughter. Yes. And I don't know, maybe a lot of you knew that out there, but it's just interesting that God named his son Isaac laughter because, here was Abraham, he kind of laughed, and then Sarah, they're just laughing about it, Yes. But so it's a son of laughter. God never let him forget about
It's almost to say in our common vernacular, this thing got real. Well, folks, our time is up, and we certainly enjoyed having you with us and studying together as we look at the scheme of redemption as it unfolds in the life of Abraham. And so what we want to encourage you to do, that we hope that you benefited from these moments with us as we spent it with the Master. And so until next Thursday at 7 p.m., my friends, may God bless you throughout the day and throughout the week.
And just let me add before we go,
Sure.
Have a very happy and safe holiday, Thanksgiving, to you and your family while we think of it.
Yes.